All right, well, let's kick things off. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Jeffrey Engel. I'm the director of the Center for Presidential History, and we have come today to discuss what's going on. These are remarkable times in presidential history, to be sure, in presidential politics, in American politics, in the politics of the First Amendment. There's a whole lot swirling around the United States today, some of it not great. So what we'd like to do is call our experts here together, and we're going to ask each of them to, I'm going to ask each of them to offer a few thoughts on what they think is a critical issue to consider. But the real reason we're here is to hear from you. We want to hear your questions and answer your questions and go the directions you want to go. So if you wouldn't mind, take a gander at the bottom of your webinar screen, and you'll see a Q&A function. You can type in your question there. And in addition to typing in your question there, you can see other questions, and you can actually like those questions, which moves them further and further up the queue. So if everybody likes a single question, I'll see it faster. So please use that freely. We expect you'll use it politely, and we'll love to hear what you have to say. Let me just start with the briefest of introductions to my fellow panelists. I'm really so grateful that they were able to take the time out of their schedules to join us today. First, we have Rita Kirk, who is the William F. May Endowed Director of the Carrie M. McGuire Center for Ethics and Public Responsibility. She is an expert in media, communications, elections, and frankly, the whole of American politics. We're also joined by Dale Carpenter, the Judge William Hawley Atwell Chair of Constitutional Law and Professor of Law. He is an expert in constitutional law, seems appropriate, the First Amendment and LGBT issues. And then finally, Lachlan Bloom, who is the Larry and Jane Harlan Senior Research Fellow and Professor of Law at SMU Law School. He's an expert in constitutional law, civil liberties, and freedom of speech and rhetoric issues, among many other things. It occurs to me after reading that introduction, I'm the only one without an endowed chair here. So let's somebody get on that. Okay, without further ado, I think, Rita, would you mind kicking us off and telling us what youth is going through your mind right now about the issues swirling through American politics?
Well, I'd love to talk with you about that. And part of it goes back to some of the research I'm doing. I wanted to share a few headlines with you for just a second. A senator warns that 100,000 enemies stalk the land. There is a blacklist used by the Department of Justice to expel enemies accused of treason. There are dossiers that have been leaked purporting to show that Russia is behind some of the subversion efforts. And there are company executives from across the country financing ultra-protectionist organizations to augment law enforcement officers to defend the government. Now, those are some pretty enticing headlines, but I want to point out that those headlines came from 1917, not from today. So I guess the first thing that I wanted to point out is this is not the first time that we have faced these kinds of issues in our government, where there have been uprisings, where there's been a general distrust of government, where our country has been divided. I started several years ago with an opportunity to write a book on hate speech. And during that period of time, I looked at how hate speech works as a stratagem if people want to divide us instead of unite us, and how that works. Well, you can imagine, I was really pleased because the book won all kinds of awards, including the award for the outstanding work on human rights in North America, which was a great honor to me. But people keep wanting me to go back and write about hate speech, and particularly in an age of COVID, it's so dark and so oppressing that it was just really too much for me to get back into looking at all of the evil, really, that is afoot with us. But that led me to the current questions that I'm more interested in, particularly as the director of the Ethics Center, which is, what do we know about how we heal from those marked moments? So going back in and even looking at the headlines from 1917, looking at other times when we've been divided, I'm really working in my efforts to try to say, how do we learn how to come together? And how do we make democracy function by using persuasive communication as opposed to authoritarian edicts? mostly, how do we tear down those barriers between us? So those are some of the issues that I'm really interested in, and I look forward to talking with you and the rest of the group about those.
Well, I certainly think there's a lot there to chew on already. And I know we're going to get back to the issue of moving forward and how to do that cooperatively as a country. Lachlan, would you mind hitting us next?
Yeah. First of all, I want to quarrel a little bit with the title of this panel, which refers to a constitutional crisis. That is a cliche that is thrown around fairly readily whenever some undecided issue of constitutional law happens to occur. There is no constitutional crisis. In fact, I would argue that we've only had one constitutional crisis in the history of the country, and that's the Civil War. That was a constitutional crisis. Maybe the struggle over Roosevelt's proposal to pack the Supreme Court might qualify, but beyond that, that's it. Essentially, what we have is a political argument. Trump's speech was a political stunt. The invasion of the Capitol was also a political stunt. The drive to impeach him, the successful impeachment in the House, was also a political stunt. And all of this will be resolved through the political process, not by the federal courts and not applying any kind of constitutional doctrine. It seems to me that the last thing on earth that President Biden would like to have is Trump being center stage after the inauguration. And that's exactly what a trial in the Senate would result in. Consequently, I think the Biden administration would like Trump to just go away. So given that Biden is almost certainly the leader of the Democratic Party, why did they impeach President Trump again? I have two theories, pure speculation. One is that it was a bone thrown to the progressives in the party, who probably are going to be the single biggest thorn in Biden's side. They hate Trump. They want to get revenge on Trump. And consequently, this was an opportunity to attempt to please them in an administration that is not going to follow their particular agenda. Secondly, I think it may be an attempt to delegitimize Trump and his supporters, basically to pave the way toward repealing everything that Trump accomplished. There are a couple of constitutional issues that are at the margins, which I may discuss later, but they will not be decided by a federal court. It seems to me that one of the projects of the Roberts Court is to emphasize standing and political question doctrine to keep the court from getting involved in these intense political controversies. And this is another area where that would in fact happen. To use a sports analogy, if the Senate did in fact hold a trial and did convict President Trump, I think that it would be no replay. The federal courts would have nothing to do with it. They would not argue that it was unconstitutional. They would not endorse it. They would simply say, it's a political question. You have the final say on it. And I think that's essentially what's going to happen. If a Senate trial were to occur. Now, as a Republican, I'm hoping and wishing that it does occur, because it would distract from the Biden agenda and from the Biden presidency. And that's the last thing that he as an accomplished politician would like to see happen. So I doubt that it will happen. It will be swept under the rug and dismissed once he is inaugurated.
Thank you. Much to chew on there for sure. Dale.
Thank you, Jeffrey, for inviting me to be here. And I thank the Center for Presidential History for hosting this webinar so that we can talk at least about some of the very important issues that I think are confronting us, whether that turns out to be in court or whether it turns out to be in the political realm or whether it just turns out to be a discussion that we need to have about our values as Rita referred to them. I also want to thank Rita. I think Rita's exactly right that in some ways, at least, the circumstances in which we face are not completely alien to American history. She's certainly right about that. In fact, I think we faced much worse in different times, and Lack mentioned one of those, certainly one of those episodes, the Civil War. And I think Lack is right to ask why it is we should even face the question of whether the president's conduct is impeachable or whether it's prosecutable, and why the possible consequences are being pursued. Because I think there is value in trying to figure out exactly what it is that the president did, what sort of responsibility does he have for what ensued, not just after the speech that he gave on January 6th, but for the actions that he and his lawyers took and his associates in the Congress took after the election. All of those things I think are very much on the table, and we ought to be discussing them and ought to be discussing them seriously. I just wrote down a very short list, and I want to be brief because I want to be respectful of the questions that I know everybody is going to have, and have our discussion driven by those questions. But just a brief list of some of the issues that I think we have on this table. We have, certainly for the first time in our history, a president impeached in the House of Representatives for incitement to insurrection against the US government, incitement to violence, incorporating not only the speech that he gave on January the 6th and the circumstances in which he gave that speech, but the actions that he took, including conversations he had with elected officials, apparently trying to get them to change certified votes in the states. That involves very large questions of the integrity of our electoral system and the votes as certified in the states. That needs to be addressed. We have the question of incitements. We've got insurrection, we've got incitement, and the question of whether or not some people can be incited, and perhaps the president could be charged with incitement to the lawless, dangerous, possibly catastrophic attack on the United States Capitol, including killing 5 people, endangering the lives of many others, including possibly people in the line of succession to the presidency of the United States. We've got the issue of impeachment. Is it an impeachable offense, whether or not a court would say so? Is it an impeachable offense for a president to incite to insurrection? And is there enough evidence that, in fact, the president did incite to insurrection? Can the president be tried even after he leaves office? And why would we engage in that trial? I think there are answers to those questions. For the first time that I know of in our history, we have actively faced the question for the very first time of whether the president might be incapable of functioning in office, of carrying out his duties, and urged by a lot of responsible people, including not just Democrats, but a lot of people saying that the vice president should invoke the Section 4 of the 25th Amendment to force him out of office. I've never heard discussion as serious as it was during the past week or so. And then, of course, we've got the possibility, aside from impeachment and aside from the 25th Amendment, which seems unlikely to be invoked, we've got the question of whether or not the president will be prosecuted, could be prosecuted, will be prosecuted. I tend to agree with my colleague Lack that there are a lot of reasons why the Biden administration would not want to pursue it, but could he be? And if so, facing that prospect, might the president, again, for the very first time in American history, assert a power to pardon himself from his otherwise criminal conduct? And what other defenses might the president have, as I think there would be, against a potential prosecution? I think we've arrived in a time in our history, a moment in our history, when we face just a miasma of, if not constitutional crises, then crises that do involve questions of our basic democratic and Republican government values and what we think of them and how we intend to abide by them. Of course, we face a kind of fever, a high point, a fever pitch in this country on two levels, not just in the events of the past week and maybe the past few months, but we face it in a time of pandemic. My hope and my expectation is that over the next few weeks, months, and I think in the next years, we will break that fever, that the fever will go down. But I don't think that's going to happen automatically. And I think that one of the things that has to happen is that corrective actions should be taken and that accountability must be had for improper actions. What form that should take or will take, I think, remains to be seen. And those are the kinds of questions that I would be happy to discuss if someone has questions about them.
Well, we have a lot of questions flying in. Everybody, please keep them coming. The questions are breaking down into a couple categories. Political, also sort of meta questions about American society, and also some rather specific questions about the particular moment that we're in. I want to start with the specific, actually, and build upwards. Dale, let me go back to something that you said just a moment ago about the president pardoning himself. That's something that many people are interested in on our list. Can you walk us through, if he can, and if so, what does that mean?
Well, so I've just written an op-ed about this, believe it or not. I think it's going to be available soon, but not quite yet. So I'll just give you a little foretaste of that. The Constitution explicitly gives the president the power of pardons and reprieves. So he is given that power. It's explicitly in Article 2 of the Constitution. Presidents have used that power to pardon all kinds of people from people that they don't know and that were just recommended that they pardon, to people that may have been involved in crimes that are close to them or friends of theirs, associates or political allies of them. All of those things are involved. The question of president pardoning himself, this is a power that comes down from England. It's a power originally borrowed from England, but of course, in the American context, it's not a kingly or monarchical power. The question of the president pardoning himself has arisen from time to time. Consideration has been given to that over just the last 50 years in, I think, 3 other cases before now that I can think of seriously considered. One of them would have been President Nixon in the midst of the Watergate crisis. Another one would have been the first President Bush when there was an investigation into the Iran-Contra scandal. Some of you may remember that episode. And then there was a third possibility, some discussion at least, that President Clinton might pardon himself for any kind of crimes that might have been committed in the Whitewater scandal. Some of you may remember that as well. So it's not the first time. It would be the first time a president asserted that power. My view, and this is not a unanimous view of constitutional scholars, my view is that the president cannot pardon himself, that it would be contrary to the original understanding of the pardon power, that it would in some ways be contrary in President Trump's case to the text of the pardon power itself, which makes an exception for impeachment cases specifically. And it would be contrary to the structure of our Constitution, which envisions a separation of powers. And it would be contrary, this is probably the fourth consideration, contrary to very basic venerable legal principles that involves things like no man can be a judge in his own case, and no person, even a president, is above the law. So I don't know that my view would prevail. It would only even be tested in a court, it seems to me, if a prosecution were brought against the president and then the president moved, among other grounds, and I think he may have a few of them, among other grounds, that he had pardoned himself. And then I think a court might confront the question of whether that pardon was legitimate. I tend to agree with Lack in the following respect. I think a court would probably want to avoid these large, unresolved constitutional questions if it could do so, and might just throw out a prosecution on the grounds that that there wasn't factual, sufficiently legally recognizable facts for a prosecution to be brought, or that constitutional principles, including the First Amendment, shield the president from prosecution.
So, Lackland, can you help us understand, if the president does pardon himself, how long would those questions that Dale just raised take to reach courts for them to either decide to answer those big constitutional questions or to punt on the issue? How long would that take, and what do you think of the pardon?
Well, as Dale admitted, it would not be a legal case until the president was prosecuted for a federal crime. Now, under the pardoning power, he can only pardon himself for federal offenses. Consequently, the pardoning, if he were to self-pardon, it would have no impact on any criminal case that was brought in the states, such as in New York, where he's being investigated. Another view, a different view of the pardoning power, is that there are no limitations on it whatsoever. That a president can pardon whoever he wants, whenever he wants, and that's pretty much final. I think there is a relatively strong argument that if the court were to confront it on the merits, it would conclude it's a political question, and the system needs to work it out on its own. We're not going to get involved. I agree with Dale that they would probably dismiss the case on narrower grounds, however, but I don't think the issue would ever make its way to the Supreme Court. I think the Roberts Court is on a mission to keep us from placing all of our reliance on the Supreme Court to resolve controversial issues. And I think this is one more.
Rita, we've talked about the legal aspects of pardoning. Walk us through the ethical aspects, if you will.
There's so many ethical issues that are related to this. First of all, again, whether you can be your own judge, it's a huge ethical issue. Whether you can pardon yourself, or for that matter, members of your family, which also seems to be one of those larger issues that people are considering. So there is the feeling that if you haven't done anything wrong, that standing in court could actually help you prove your case. And I guess I have a slightly different opinion. At one point, Lackland made the comment that this is not something that's actually going to be decided in a federal court. And he's right. But the courts are terribly important to what happens from a public relations notion here. That is, what do people think happened? Right now, the media is so bifurcated that it's difficult for the public to tell where the truth is. In a court of law, there are standards of evidence. There are things that can or cannot be admitted. So the courts are imperative in terms of us working through this crisis because of those standards and because we believe that what will come out of that is closer to a sense of justice, even though there may be different interpretations of the facts. So it requires us to be more logical and methodical about our conclusions. Right now, we're feeding misinformation because just like machine learning in general, we all have those incidents where Siri or somebody hears us talking about a car that we're thinking of purchasing, and the next thing, every pop up and pop under on our computer screen is about a car or a dealership. So we've seen how machine learning works. Well, news learning works the same way. Once it determines what my predispositions are, I start getting a lot more news feeds that feed my predispositions. So we don't have a good arbiter outside the court really for helping us sort wheat from chaff. And this is going to be, I think, a very important thing going forward for the fate of our nation.
Okay, so let me ask about the courts specifically, and then go to the meta question about what we do about information. Because one of the arguments that I have been making to try to understand whether or not there is any validity to President Trump's claims of election malfeasance was to say, look, 61 federal courts, or at least 61 courts, have looked at this. And then last time I checked, 60 out of 61 said there is actually no evidence, and try to use the courts as that arbiter. Clearly that hasn't worked.
Right.
Clearly, you know, I don't think the people who were standing at the vice president's podium after they took the Senate bothered to read the briefs of the court. So what do we do in that situation? How do we make that news learning, machine learning work in our favor, I guess?
Well, you know, part of what we absolutely have to be concerned about is basic civics 101. Because a court, I mean, there's this notion that the courts just refuse to hear it. And we're hearing that a lot. If you look at the public opinion polls, their notion is that the courts dismissed, meaning they didn't hear anything at all, refused to hear the case. Well, that's not really the case. They still had to consider the briefs to see if there was any justifiable means for moving forward. But that's a misinformation just about how the basic processes of government works. There has been a call for in our country for some time about better civics education, about how the processes of our government works. And I think it could be no more critical than it is now. And in fact, Jeff, one of the things that I notice is that you're constantly being asked questions about process. It's one of the things that people are very concerned about and just don't know, and they don't know where to go to get that information.
I think that's right. And, you know, the civics point is a great one, not least because it's absolutely true that we have a hue and cry for more civics in this country, but not as much enthusiasm to actually pay for it as we should. But the interesting thing about process is that I don't ever know how deep to go. I mean, I don't know that our 7th graders need to know about the question of whether or not the president can pardon themselves, though maybe that's a broader ethical question that should be brought up, because it brings up the real notions, as Dale and Lackland said, about where our constitutional government derives its power from. Let's go back, though, to the big issue, return to Trump, if you will, and the impeachment. And Carolyn Bertel asked a question which many people have been enthusiastic about, myself included, noting that if there is no trial in the Senate, how might President Trump be held accountable for his action? We'll keep it focused on President Trump at this point. And in particular, Lackland, and I noticed this too, you said that most of the things that had occurred on the 6th and after in this realm were political stunts. I'd love to hear your definition of political stunt as you answer that question. What is a stunt and what is not?
By that, I meant that all 3 events were designed to influence the polity. Trump, the invasion of the Capitol, and the impeachment were all designed for political purposes, not legal purposes. They were designed to influence people and how they thought about it and how they approached it. So that's what I'm talking about.
But I think stunt has a connotation of lacking in substance. Is that the way that you mean it? Because by your definition that you just gave, the State of the Union is also a political stunt, and
Yeah.
a declaration of war is a political stunt.
Probably.
All right, fair enough. Dale, did you want to jump in?
Well, I mean, so it is true that just about everything that goes on in the United States related to its government certainly is a stunt in the way that I think Lack conceives of it. But there are stunts that are trivial and harmless. And then there are other kinds of stunts that are extraordinarily dangerous. Dangerous to people, dangerous to the government, dangerous to our principles. You could call the assassination of President Lincoln a political stunt by John Wilkes Booth, and it was that, but it killed a president and it decapitated the government of the United States and could have done even greater damage than it did. It is true that the people on the ellipse on January 6th who gathered with President Trump and others speaking to them were doing so for political reasons. Some of them in quite theatrical ways. Who could forget the images of the man in horns and goat hair or whatever he was in and war paint on his face parading around the Capitol? Turns out he was an unemployed actor or something like that, living in his mother's home.
Let me just stop you to point out that I've already secured that as next year's Halloween costume.
Well, right. But this is the difference. If you go to a Halloween party, Jeffrey, and you carry weapons and you beat police officers, Capitol Hill police officers, or you plant pipe bombs in the building, you're going to be criminally liable. I wouldn't call that a stunt. That is a crime. And if a person is incited to commit that crime, that person can also be prosecuted. And when that person happens to be the president of the United States, he speaks with a megaphone that influences a lot of people. Now, I'm not saying that Donald Trump can necessarily be prosecuted for incitement. I think we'll have to test that proposition. Among other things, I doubt that he will be. We'll see. And I think his speech may well turn out to be protected because there's a lot of speech that is very provocative that is nevertheless protected under Supreme Court precedent. But this is a serious matter. You had hundreds of people invading the Capitol, threatening to hang Mike Pence. I don't think they were joking. That wasn't just a stunt. That was an extraordinarily dangerous moment in the United States. I'm glad that senators and members of Congress weren't slain as a result of it. So that, I think, can't be dismissed as just a trivial matter.
So I'm going to throw this question open to any of you who feel like fielding it, and really push on that question of what is inciting to violence, because it is notable that the resolution of impeachment is basically only focused on the events of January 6th. Though I think one can make an argument that President Trump said many similar things before, and that President Trump certainly undermined faith in the concept of a free and fair election for many months before, if not back to 2015, to be honest. So was it a good choice politically, and more importantly, I think maybe legally, for the Democrats who led that movement to focus so narrowly on January 6th?
I would like to speak to that. Throughout most of the 19th century, the Supreme Court and the United States courts proceeded on the basis that speech could be prosecuted if it had a so-called bad tendency. And the case that comes to mind when I consider the allegations that Trump incited the crowd is the United States versus Debs, which was decided back in 1919. Debs was a socialist candidate who had run several times for the presidency of the United States. he gave a speech in Chicago, I think, in which he argued against the draft and argued that he would resist the draft no matter what, and made the statement that there were things that he couldn't say, but everybody knew what he meant. There was no direct incitement in the speech whatsoever. Nevertheless, the Supreme Court upheld his conviction in an opinion by Justice Holmes, in which he was very deferential to the jury verdict. Holmes was castigated by civil libertarians for that particular decision, and it seemed to have an impact on him and may have led directly to his change of opinion the following term in his Abrams dissent. For 40 years, civil libertarians battled to get the court to do away with the bad tendency approach. And finally it did in the case of Brandenburg versus Ohio, in which it laid down the principle that you cannot prosecute someone because of their speech unless it incites imminent violence. And incitement is something more than advocacy. In that particular case, a Ku Klux Klan leader had mentioned that they were considering marching on Washington for purposes of revengeance, as he put it. That the Supreme Court unanimously overruled that conviction and held incitement plus eminence. That is the standard. And I listened to President Trump's speech at the time, and I now have a transcript of it. I read it this morning, and there's nothing that would qualify as incitement in that particular speech. If the court applied the bad tendency test, as it had, again, through most of the 19th century, Trump could be prosecuted legally for his speech. If the court applies the Brandenburg incitement approach, no way. And any prosecution for incitement would be thrown out. The statute itself, and I looked at the statute, bans insurrection, engaging in insurrection. The statute on its face, to the extent that it extends to conduct, would probably be constitutional. To the extent that it is applied to speech, it would be unconstitutional, and the courts would readily hold.
Yeah,
Please, Dale.
if I can just add, I think Lack is correct that the Brandenburg standard, the one that he references, is very, very difficult to meet. It's a very high threshold, and there's a reason for this. The federal government was trying to constantly punish dissenting, unpopular speech. That was a real problem that the court faced, especially after the civil rights era and especially after the protests around the Vietnam War. The standard requires that for the speech to be punished, it has to be directed to producing imminent lawless action and likely to produce imminent lawless action. The speech of a Ku Klux Klan member, I think it was in Ohio actually, saying that someday we may march on Washington did not meet that standard because nobody was imminently likely to actually do anything that they claimed. The difference here is we had a president of the United States within blocks of the Capitol telling thousands of people, some of whom were armed, people that he had gathered there, to block a certification of a vote that was perfectly valid in the United States Congress, not directly instructing them to do so, but a crowd right there at the Capitol on the day that the Congress was meeting. Now, I don't know that that would meet the definition of incitement in Brandenburg. I think there's actually going to be an interesting argument about that, but it does make the circumstances a little more precarious in terms of a prosecution. I would add this: Congress is not limited in its impeachment articles to those things that are defined as crimes under federal law. Congress can be more broad in what it regards as impeachable conduct, and it has been. and that will not be reviewable in the Supreme Court. Moreover, Jeffrey, I would just quibble with one little note, I think, in your question, and that is the idea that the Congress only mentioned the January 6th rally. In fact, the Congress also mentioned events in the lead up to the certification of the Electoral College votes, which should have occurred just as a formal matter on January 6th, including the president's call to Raffensperger, I think is his name, the Secretary of State in Georgia, who the president threatened him with possible prosecution unless he found enough votes for President Trump to win the election. Everybody knew in that crowd that that was the background, and that the president was claiming that he had had a landslide and that the election had been unlawfully stolen from him. That's enough to rile up a crowd, and I think the president knew that.
Thank you actually for that clarification. I think that's very handy. In fact, I'm going to offer another clarification and then Rita, toss it to you for a second, because I want to just expand for a second on the point that you made that if we want to think about what the standard needs to be for inciting the violence, that's only if we care about what happens in the courts. If we're talking about what happens in an impeachment trial, the standard is what 67 senators think it is. And that is the definition of a high crime in some ways, is placing oneself above the needs of the state. And it doesn't actually have to meet any standard that would apply elsewhere, because it's a political decision. Obviously, it's not a legal decision. And the Constitution says once you are convicted of a political crime, if you are impeached and convicted, then you're subject to prosecution for whatever you did. So I think we need to remember that there are two paths that are diverging here, though they might come back together again in a sense. Rita, help me out of this sentence, which I didn't know how to end.
No, I think you did a brilliant job. I think there may be even a third area, and that is what happens in that court of opinion. And what the American people believe about what happens is equally important. And in this, I'm really going to indict, I think, all of us that are in this room. What does it take for somebody to take up arms against their government and rush the Capitol the way that they did? I mean, we could argue that there are a few crazy people in the world, but not all of the people in the universe out here in the United States are completely crazy. And yet, if you look at the numbers of people who believe that this election was stolen from them, there's something that tells them that it's not right, or something that they're wanting to believe rather than the truth. And the truth has got to be an important part here. What did happen? Why were those people there? And you know, the immediate thing that came out after the awful pictures with us sitting watching things that day was that it was Antifa that did it, that there was some, left-wing group that was really responsible for making the right wing look guilty. And we saw the hate speech just foment and explode on the social media. We are a divided country, and part of the reason that we have gotten to this crisis is we have stopped listening to each other. When we watch a Congress that models behavior where even they don't understand that compromise is a good thing to have happen in moving our country forward, then what we end up with is extremists on each side, and the only battle is what's taking place at the ballot box, so that we know who's going to win this vote and who's going to win that. So we don't see the Congress as being something that's ever united about anything. It's always the Republicans and the Democrats. Those are basic fallacies of what's going on our democratic system. So in order to get back to more reasonable spaces, we have to learn how to take advantage of listening to people with whom we disagree. And we are notoriously bad for doing that, particularly now. It's certainly not modeled on the news chat shops. It's hopefully modeled here in academia. But it's even difficult for us sometimes to listen to viewpoints that we don't like.
Well, I listened to you because I like what you said. So, but I want to delve into that and bring the Constitution back in, because we have a great question from Margie Evans, one of my students, who wants to know, okay, given everything you just said, what are the legal issues about media and personalities who work on TV and radio and so on, who are offering blatant lies, who are as she says, encouraging their audience to believe the lie? What do we do in that situation when, obviously, we all are aware of the First Amendment? Is there any deeper thought that we should have than just, sorry, it's the First Amendment rights?
Well, I think there's so many things that we can do. I think we have to have a will to do it. And so that's the first thing. One of the great things that have happened in previous controversies in our history is that there seems to be this greater sense of unity and identity that becomes rational at a point. I mean, things can get crazy for a while, but at some point we realize being peaceful is more important than being at war with each other. When we watched what happened in Northern Ireland, how do we eventually bring people to the peace table? It's because we have to start talking to each other and seeing our interdependence on each other. What happens in those talk shows right now is they continue to talk because we continue to listen. If we really wanted to control what happens in our media, we would put our ratings where we put our values. We would stop listening so that there is no financial incentive to put people on the air who take us to extremes. So the market principle can certainly have a lot to do with the way that we handle things. A second thing, we are like moths to a flame. Boy, the first, it's like what happens around the water cooler every day, right? Any juicy piece of gossip just spreads like wildfire. And the social media is so full of wildfire that it's just fun to pick it up and repeat it. And you can't wait to be the first person in your social media group to share that delightful piece of information. So part of it is to be more responsible about what we listen to, about what we subscribe to, and about the people whose opinions we trust and repeat on social media. I have a great friend who I love dearly, but he cannot seem to sort fact from fiction any day. So it's like a daily thing for me, fact checking what he's doing. And that's, believe it or not effective. The fact that he wants to believe it means that he's going to continue to believe it, but he has to meet some opposition at some point. And if it's an opposition that he loves, if it's somebody that he trusts, he's more likely eventually to break down and think about it than if it's just some data thrown in his face or some hostility thrown back.
Gentlemen, mind approaching this question from a constitutional angle?
I would call your attention to Justice Brennan's opinion in New York Times versus Sullivan, which is considered to be the greatest First Amendment case of all time. One of the points that he made was, and he was quoting Madison on this particular principle, is that there is no official test of truth. The government can't decide what truth is. We have to work it out on our own. And it's often difficult and will result in great controversy. But it's better to allow the citizens to argue about it than to allow the government to simply pronounce it.
I agree with that. And I would say maybe the two most important words that Lack uttered in that disquisition were the government. So the government is not permitted to be the arbiter of what is the truth. Private newspapers, websites, and other entities are free to make editorial decisions. And when it comes to speech that is unprotected, including incitement and malicious libel, as in New York Times versus Sullivan and other certain areas of speech, the government can act. But those are the exceptions rather than the rule. Instead, I think the better approach for speech that is false and that is malicious is the approach that Rita suggested, and that is counter speech, gentle correction, bringing questions to speech that is wrong, challenging it in some ways, at least that are civil. is probably our best approach ordinarily. The problem is, as we know, especially now in the age of Twitter and Facebook and all of these other apps, is that a lie gets around the world about 10 billion times before the truth gets out of bed. I mean, that's more true now, I think, than it has ever been in human history.
So we're unfortunately approaching the end of our time together, metaphorically speaking, and we need to think about what comes next. Now, Rita, you began your remarks by talking about the idea that the country needs to find a way to unite. And I want to throw this question to all of you, that one of the major arguments from President Trump's supporters on the floor of the House of Representatives arguing against the impeachment resolution was simply this, that an impeachment would cause too much unnecessary pain, or would make it harder to get over these divisions. I think there's a legal implication to that. I think there's a historical, there's a moral implication to that. What is your reaction when you hear that argument, and do you think it has some validity for going forward?
I think it's a very solid argument, quite frankly. If Joe Biden has any mandate whatsoever, it is, I'm going to return things to normalcy. Trump was impulsive, he was all over the map, and I'm going to bring that to an end. Impeaching a president who is no longer in office is not normal. It's not a return to normalcy. It simply stokes the fires. And consequently, as I'm hoping, as I assume, it will not happen. And for the best reasons, it should not happen.
Dale, Rita?
Well, so I think it's true that impeaching a president and really what's on the table is possibly convicting a president after he's out of office is not normal. But that's an abnormal act that is a response to an abnormal time. Now, at some point, we've got to stop this sort of cycle of retribution, of response, and someone has to de-escalate. I don't know if this is that point, because there is an objective here that is important. The most dangerous attack that occurred on January 6th was not the physical attack on the United States Capitol that resulted in 5 deaths. The most serious attack that occurred on January 6th came from within inside the Capitol. It happened that night when 147 members of the United States House of Representatives and 6 members of the Senate decided that they would not recognize the legally validly certified electoral votes from tens of millions of American citizens. That cannot become normal. And for it not to become normal, there needs to be accountability. And that means it needs to be deterred. There has to be some kind of price. Maybe that has to just be a political price, which is just what Lack suggested earlier. But I think it is an extraordinary thing, and it may call for some extraordinary measures. Let me end just with this note of hope, if I may, just really quickly. There is good news here, and that is that in the midst of the worst pandemic we've seen, at least in 100 years, it may get worse, but at least in that time, the United States managed to conduct an extraordinarily fair, well-run election in which 160 million Americans voted. 74 million of them or so for President Trump, and I think 81 million or so for President-elect Biden. That was an accomplishment of American democracy, of which we should be extraordinarily proud. And I think we can take that pride into the future as we move into President Biden's term in office. So I think that offers some hope that Americans are really engaged politically, and they need to be engaged now politically more than ever.
Rita?
love what Dale just said, and I'm going to extend on that for just a little bit. In almost every case that you look at where people are deeply divided, it takes some precipitating event to bring us close together again. So we had Pearl Harbor, we had 9/11 attack. Here we had COVID. This was the president's golden opportunity to unite the whole country together with a common mission. We saw it work when we saw what happened when you remove the barriers and all of the scientists worked together to try to come up with a solution. And we did it in a way that saved perhaps years off of people doing traditional medical research by just simply allowing people to work together towards some common goal. I think we have to do the same sort of thing here. I regret the fact that COVID robbed us of the opportunity, the way that the president responded to that we didn't have a chance to move together, to really care for each other. And I worry at what the precipitating event will be that finally draws us together. But there will be something. There will be the day when we have a chance to unify. And we can either wait for that crisis to occur and somebody from the outside force us in many ways to join arms and bring us back to our proverbial knees, or we can make resolutions that we're going to do things to eliminate the conditions that brought us here in the first place. Donald Trump isn't just the problem. He was elected. He was put into place. There were a lot of people who were dissatisfied. There were a lot of people who found his words comforting and empowering and wanted that proverbial overthrow of the government. And when they didn't get it during his term, they're seeking it now by other means. We have to be able to address those issues because there's a lot of hurt out there. And until that goes away, we will stay at danger.
That's so eloquent. I don't know how to follow, especially since we're nearing the end. Let me offer one concluding thought, though, which is many reasons have been given for not pursuing President Trump's trial in the Senate. Many reasons have been given in this hour for doing so. One that I have not heard, which I think is maybe implied in some of the comments that we've had, is that it's simply the right thing. That there must be consequences for inciting violence politically, again, not whether or not it meets the standard. And Lachlan, I would just suggest to you the wonderful analogy you used of not stirring the fire. What do we do if the fire is going to grow and consume itself? What do we do at that point? If the fire is growing, I don't know that ignoring it is the problem. It's not going to go away on its own. There are many more points we could have made and many more metaphors to abuse, but I thank you for bringing up so many issues, my friends. This was a really great discussion. I enjoyed it. Thank you to the McGuire Center for their help. Thank you for the Dedman School of Law. Thank you to Dedman College. And if you are interested in these sorts of issues, which apparently you are because you're watching, keep watching. We're going to keep doing these, and you can go to the Center for Presidential History website to find out more. And by the way, listen to our new podcast too, or at least like it and review it. So thank you all, and we'll see you next time.